Good evening, everybody. We're so glad that you're here with us tonight as part of Temple Bethel, Boca Raton, and St. Joan of Arc Catholic Church's annual Interfaith Weekend. This year is the 35th annual weekend that Temple Bethel and St. Joan of Arc Catholic Church have shared over these many years. It's an extraordinary interfaith community that we have here in Boca Raton. And the original interfaith partnership between Temple Bethel and St. Joan of Arc Catholic Church really served to redefine what interfaith understanding and connection and collaboration could mean in our community. Temple Bethel and St. Joan of Arc go back many, many years, but there was an extraordinary event that launched our efforts at Interfaith Dialogue. It happened that in the early 1980s, it was Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the Jewish year. And at that time, our congregation had an early service and a later service. And this was before the internet. This is before text messaging. And a bomb threat was phoned in to Temple Bethel during the early service. And so my predecessor, Rabbi Merle Singer, closed his book and said to everyone, "This will conclude the return to your cars and return to your homes." No one really knew what happened. But then the police came and they weren't sure whether they had searched the building adequately, and they knew that another 1,000 people were coming to worship in about an hour. And so Rabbi Singer called over to St. Joan and said, "Would it be possible for us to use the church for our worship?" And they said, "Well, of course you can." And so began an extraordinary sense of community and collaboration that has enabled our two congregations to really build bonds of understanding and friendship across the street of 4th Avenue. It was amazing on September 11th when there was fears about another attempt at Temple Bethel to see our children holding hands, walking across the street to find refuge in the embrace of a Catholic church. And then at Temple Bethel, we began to wonder whether maybe God loves Catholics more, because after Hurricane Wilma, the electricity at St. Joan of Arc was returned after about 2 or 3 days, but the electricity at Temple Bethel didn't come back for 5 or 6 days. But during the time that St. Joan had their power and we didn't, they were kind enough to bring us coffee to allow us to use their copier. The friendship that we have runs deep. And our interfaith dialogue has also helped us to better understand who we are as Jews through the lens of Catholic tradition. And hopefully, as I've heard from so many people from St. Joan, help them to understand their Catholicism through the lens that we at Temple Bethel are able to provide during our Interfaith Weekend. We are really blessed that we have an extraordinary scholar who will be with us this weekend to share his learning and his erudition, his understanding of the connections, the intricate interweavings of the early Christian period and the rabbinic period, to see how the roots of our different traditions are woven together. And that wonderful scholar is Rabbi Dr. Josh Garroway. Dr. Garroway serves as the Saul and Arlene Bronstein Professor of Judaeo-Christian Studies and Professor of Early Christianity and Second Commonwealth Judaism at the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in Los Angeles, California. Rabbi Garroway earned his ordination at the Cincinnati campus of the Hebrew Union College in 2003, and then went on to earn his doctorate from Yale University in 2008. His books and scholarly articles focus on the emergence of Christianity against the backdrop of Second Temple and Rabbinic Judaism. He also lectures widely on broader themes of Jewish history. He's a native of Rochester, New York, and lives in Pasadena with his wife, Professor Christine Garroway, and their 3 school-aged children. We're so blessed, Josh, to have you as part of our congregation, our community, and we look forward to the exposition you're going to share with us tonight on the unique place it has in Jewish and Christian history.
Unmute. Wonderful. I hope people can hear me. And I hope that as I push this button, you are seeing the presentation and not my presenter tool. That means we're already off to a great start. So thank you, Rabbi Dan, for that very warm introduction. And hearing the history of this Interfaith Weekend was really inspiring and makes me a little humbled to be a part of it. I hope that I can do it justice. It's also great, by the way, to see Rabbi Weissman, who is a former student of mine, and I was able to catch up with his wife and children earlier tonight, and that was a delight. So as you will see, let me tell you actually first, because I don't know, I think this puts people at ease. I plan to talk for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to do questions afterwards. And I do this kind of thing for a living, 3-4 days a week. And so I'm pretty good about keeping to the time expectations. So if you're getting a little bored, you can look down at your watch and think, oh goodness, he will be done at this given time. If you're excited, I apologize. You'll have to say, oh Lordy, he's going to be done at this time. There won't be more. But you can pretty much rest assured that I'll speak for about 45 minutes. And then I'm delighted to answer any questions that you have. So you'll see from the title slide here that what we're going to be talking about for most of this evening is St. Paul. Now, if you don't have any idea who St. Paul is, that's fine. I'll help you out with that in a few moments. But as Rabbi Dan said in the introduction, one of the things I like to do is to be as broad as possible when I am teaching communities. So St. Paul is one guy in one specific time a couple of thousand years ago. In order to give a little breadth to what we're going to be talking about today, I actually want to begin by talking about something and someone that is many centuries removed from Paul, another Jewish figure, and one of those Jewish figures I hope to meet one day in the afterlife, because he is a fascinating man with many fascinating things to say, and that is this man right here, Moses Mendelson. Now, I don't know how many of you know who Moses Mendelson is and why he is so important. Many people argue that Moses Mendelson is the first modern Jew. So Moses Mendelson lived in the northern part of what is today Germany. It's Germany, sort of Poland, in the 18th century. And he's often referred to as the first modern Jew because Mendelson understood in the 18th century that what was going to happen in Europe in the subsequent century is that Jews were going to have an opportunity to leave behind the ghetto and join German and Austrian and French and English society. And he was the person who really first said in any sophisticated way, that's okay, and that's a good thing. And he said that Judaism should no longer be understood as a religion and a nationality simultaneously, but rather that Judaism should be understood as a religion. And that meant that if you were a Jew in Germany, when Germany opened its arms to welcome Jews into it as citizens, Jews should rush headlong into becoming Germans, speaking Germans, being educated as Germans, while at the same time preserving their unique Jewish identity. Now, it's important to remember that Mendelson was nothing like what we would think of as a Reform Jew. He said, yes, you should try to incorporate yourself into European society, but the religion that you cling to as a Jew should be the old-fashioned medieval Orthodox Judaism. But nonetheless, because he argued that Judaism should be seen as primarily a religion and not a nationality or an ethnicity, he's often described as the first modern Jew. Now, why am I starting a discussion of Paul with Mendelson? Well, Mendelson, because he was so well integrated into the philosophical discussions of 18th century Germany, he actually had a number of philosophical friends and colleagues at the time. And a very famous event occurred in the year 1769, when a famous philosopher of the day, whose name was Johann Caspar Lavater. Lavater said, oh, finally, we have a Jew who's in the public eye, and we're talking and we're discussing philosophy. I'm going to openly challenge Mendelson. And I'm going to say, here is the proof of Christianity. Either show me it's not true, or do the right thing and convert to Christianity. This was a very important moment in the history of modern Judaism. And I have a number of scholars who are friends who could speak at great length to you at some point about this in the future. But what I want to show you is that one of the things Mendelson said in response, and by the way, he didn't accept that Christianity was correct and convert. He refuted the claim, and it created quite a controversy in Germany at the time. But one of the things that Mendelson said in his response is that both Jews and Christians should marvel at the fact that in the 18th century in Europe, Jews still exist. Why? Because he argued that Christianity had developed such a hostile attitude towards Judaism over the course of 1,000 years or more, it was a marvel that there were still Jews there. And he said, the only reason that Jews do still exist in Europe is because, as he said, it was one humane theologian who lived more than 1,000 years before that was responsible for the survival of Jews in Europe. And so he wrote in this letter to Lavater in 1769, "Blessed be the ashes of that humane theologian. But for that humane theologian's lovely brainwave, we Jews would have been exterminated long ago." I hope you are all wondering, who is that humane theologian? And what was that lovely brainwave that kept Jews alive for 1,000 years in Europe? Who is the humane theologian? What is the lovely brainwave? Well, the humane theologian is perhaps the most famous Catholic thinker of all time, St. Augustine. And what you have here is actually a beautiful fresco of St. Augustine that is at the All Saints Church in Florence, painted by Botticelli. But I regret to inform you that while the photograph of Mendelson on the previous page was probably an accurate depiction of what Mendelson looked like, this is not what Augustine looked like. Botticelli had no idea what Augustine looked like, and no one has any idea what Augustine looked like. But it might interest you to know that this later rendering of Augustine might actually be a better representation of him. Why? Augustine was an African bishop. He was from the city of Hippo, which is today around Tunisia and Libya. And his mother's name, if you are Catholic, you surely know, his mother's name was Saint Monica. And Mon was the local deity worshipped by the native Berbers of Northwest Africa. So it's likely that his mother was a Berber, a Northwest African. And therefore, it is not unreasonable to think that St. Augustine would have looked something more like this than what a lot of subsequent European Catholics hoped he would have looked like. So I don't know what Augustine looked like, but I like to think that he resembled the man on the left side of your screen. Now, why is Augustine so important when it comes to the survival of the Jews in Europe? Because Augustine had a lovely brainwave. Keep in mind, Mendelssohn's being a little bit sarcastic when he calls it lovely, and you'll see what I mean in a moment. Because Augustine created something known as the doctrine of Jewish witness, which shaped Catholic theology about Jews, again, for more than a millennium. Well, what was this doctrine of witness? Well, in order to understand the doctrine of witness, one needs to start by understanding the Christian world into which Augustine emerged. Augustine's teacher was a fellow by the name of Ambrose of Milan. And Ambrose of Milan was famously a bishop in Milan when there was an event way out in the east in what is today Iraq, where a bunch of Christians got together and said, Jews are terrible, they reject Jesus, and therefore we are going to burn down their synagogue. And they did. And Ambrose apparently defended them and wrote letters suggesting that it was okay that they did that, and would that I would have had the opportunity to burn the synagogue here in Milan, but unfortunately there was an earthquake and it was destroyed that way. And Ambrose was one of many Christian leaders in the 4th century who appears to have suggested that there shouldn't be Jews in Europe at all. We should not allow them to live in Christendom. They can go live maybe in the East or down in Africa, but anywhere where there is Christendom, there should not be Jews. And St. Augustine, in a totally different way, in a move that really was shocking at its time, said no. In fact, Jews need to be dealt with differently in Christendom. Jews should be around. Jews should be maintained because as long as Christians go to a new place, they need to have Jews in the community because Jews serve as a witness to Christian truth. Well, how do they do that? Well, Christians might go to a new place and say, we follow Jesus, who is the Messiah that was announced in the Old Testament. And people would say, well, what's this Old Testament? Isn't that just a book of predictions that you made up? And Augustine said it's critically important that we can then say, no. Go to the Jewish community. They have all of those books. And you will see that they still read those books blindly and don't understand that they actually predict the Messiah that we worship, who is Jesus of Nazareth. So it's crucial, Augustine said, that Jews continue to abide in Christian communities. Even if they are persecuted, they are not allowed to thrive. It is vital that they are there. And he even said that the likes of Ambrose, who would say it's okay to hurt Jews or hurt synagogues, he said quite the opposite is true. You may not, under any circumstances, hurt Jews. And this actually came in handy. You may know during the Crusades, as many crusaders went down from England and France and Germany to fight in the Holy Land, they came across Jewish communities in Europe. And in many cases, those angry crusaders said, why am I going all the way to the land of Israel to fight Muslim infidels? I can fight Jewish infidels in these towns and villages along the way. And there were a number of massacres in those communities. But there were also a number of priests and bishops who stood up at that time and said, remember the teaching of Augustine. We have to have Jews in our community, and we are not allowed to cause them any harm. So many Jewish lives were indeed saved by priests and bishops during the Crusades and for subsequent centuries, so that in the 18th century, Jews of Europe like Mendelson were around. Now, Augustine's doctrine of Jewish witness says, yes, Jews should be around in Christendom. But it also said Jews should be around precisely because they are God's rejected people, and as such bear witness to the true people of the Jewish God, which is the Christian community. That is part and parcel of the doctrine of witness. On the one hand, it allowed for the survival of Jews in Europe. On the other hand, it presents the Jews of Europe as a rejected people. So now let's ask the question, where would Augustine and Ambrose and many other Christians of the 3rd and 4th century, where would they have gotten the idea that Jews are a rejected people of God? I would suggest to you that if you try to find the roots of this idea in the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth in the Gospels, you'd be hard-pressed to find it. Very hard. Some people would suggest that Jesus really didn't say much at all about non-Jews and may not have even ever interacted with non-Jews in his lifetime. The way that you find in the New Testament information that would lead someone like Augustine to propose that Jews are a rejected people of God is through Paul of Tarsus, St. Paul. So that's what we are going to focus on in the next half hour or so, the figure of St. Paul, and specifically what Paul had to say about the Jewish people and the fate of the Jewish people. So this is Paul of Tarsus as represented by Rembrandt. Again, I assure you that no medieval painter had any idea what Paul looks like. That will have to remain a mystery. But this is a magnificent painting, I think. So who was Paul of Tarsus? Well, in order to understand who Paul was, one needs to start a little bit earlier back with Jesus of Nazareth. Now, who Jesus was and what Jesus taught is the $64,000 question for historians. I would make one point. The followers of Jesus in his own lifetime believed that Jesus was going to bring about the long-awaited end of the world as Jews knew it. Jews in the first century were hoping that some remarkable figure would come and bring about the end to the state of affairs as they knew them because they were terrible. This figure would help overthrow the Roman Empire, would reinstall a king in Jerusalem, and so on and so forth. Now, of course, Jesus of Nazareth did not do that. He was crucified around the year 30 in Jerusalem. The Roman emperor was still in place. There was no new king in Jerusalem. So most people just forgot about Jesus of Nazareth, except his inner circle, who believed that 3 days later, he appeared to them, risen from the dead. And so these 12 people, or 11 before they were added a replacement for Judas, these inner circle apostles of Jesus, they believed that Jesus had risen from the dead. And so they had to try to make sense of that. Why did this happen? And it seems that what they concluded is the following. Jesus would have consummated the world as we knew it when he was here. However, the Jewish people were not ready. They had not repented enough. Therefore, he had to die and then be resurrected so that the Jews of the world could, like Jesus, die and be spiritually resurrected as new people who would be able to stand before Jesus in judgment when he came back imminently. In other words, if Jesus had brought about the end of the world when Jesus was here, no Jew would have passed muster. But by dying and being resurrected, these initial apostles thought Jews would be able to pass muster in the end if they were baptized and experienced death and resurrection themselves. So, what did these apostles do? Well, they did what any Jew in that circumstance would do. They went around to every Jew they could find in Jerusalem and in the Galilee and in Samaria, and they said, "Hey, Jews, guess what? We've been expecting God to end the world in some triumphant way. Well, it's about to happen. Jesus of Nazareth was in Jerusalem, died, and was resurrected, and now, if you are baptized into that experience, you go underwater and die and are reborn, then when Jesus returns imminently, you will pass muster in the judgment and live in the redeemed world." And so they went from synagogue to synagogue telling Jews that this was the case. Now, most Jews rejected that story. Why? They said, well, if Jesus were really the Messiah, then the world would already have been redeemed. But nonetheless, some Jews were convinced. What happened next, however, is that in many synagogues, not only in the land of Israel, but also among synagogues that were in what is today Turkey and Syria, there were not only Jews in synagogues. Just like in a synagogue like Temple Bethel, I'm guessing, there are not only Jews, there are non-Jewish wives of Jews, non-Jewish husbands of Jews. There are people from the community that aren't Jewish, but really like the synagogue because it has great rabbis and great teaching and great music. They had such things in antiquity as well, and they were known by the title of God-fearer. People who aren't Jewish, but really like Judaism or Jews. And what appears to have happened is that these apostles began a mission not only to the Jews of synagogues, but also to these Gentile hangers-on, these people who weren't quite Jewish. And they began to say to them, hey, guess what? The end of the world that we Jews have been expecting is about to happen. If ever there was a time for you to become a Jew, Now's the time. If you're a man, get circumcised. If you're a woman, prepare a Jewish life. Start living according to Jewish law. And also get baptized into the death and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. Because if you do that, then when Jesus returns imminently, you will be judged well. And so there began not only a mission to Jews, but also a mission to Gentiles to encourage them to become Jews in the final hour. That is the early mission to Gentiles that would become so important in the development of the church. It's why the Catholic Church today will eventually not be a Jewish church. Now, Paul existed at this time, and Paul apparently did not think very well of these missionaries who were going out to tell Jews and Gentiles that Jesus of Nazareth had died and been resurrected. And so he was an opponent of these early apostles. But something happened at some point in Paul's life where he came to believe that, in fact, the movement he was opposed to was correct, that Jesus of Nazareth had died, had been resurrected, and he wanted now to be a part of that movement and to spread that message, that good news or gospel. And so Paul joined this mission to the Gentiles. But in doing so, Paul had a novel idea. Paul's idea was, maybe the whole point of the death and resurrection was not so that Jews would be saved in the end, or that Gentiles could become Jews and be saved in the end, but the whole point was that through baptism into the death and resurrection, Gentiles could become judged favorably at the end without having to become Jews. In other words, what Paul argued was that, hey, Gentiles, you can join this final end of times Jewish community, not as Jews, not having been circumcised, not observing the laws of kashrut, not observing the laws of the Sabbath, but just as a Gentile. Comically, I refer to this as the policy of dip without snip. You get baptized to join the community, but there is no need for circumcision. And Paul set out for a decade trying to convince as many Gentiles as he could to come into league with the God of the Jews, but not to become a Jew. This, of course, created a tremendous amount of controversy within the early Christian community, because other Christians, like I would suggest Peter and James, said, Paul, you're nuts. You can't enter into this community unless you're a Jew. If you're a man, you can't enter this community unless you are circumcised. You can't enter this community unless you eat meals that are kosher. And so there was a great conflict between these early Christians in the years 50 and 60 and so on. I think it goes without saying that the side that won in that controversy was the side of Paul, which is today why for centuries, the Christian community has not circumcised men, eaten kosher foods, observed the Sabbath in the way that Jews do, and so on and so forth. Now, one of the things that Paul had to deal with when he was approaching Gentiles and saying, it's now time for Gentiles to come under the umbrella of the God of the Jews, but not as Jews, rather as Gentiles, is that many of these Gentiles responded by saying, why would I want to be baptized so that I can be saved by the God of the Jews when the God of the Jews is an unreliable God? Now, why would they say that the God of the Jews is an unreliable God? Because they said, look, most of the Jews who have heard about this Jesus fellow have rejected it. And God seems to have rejected God's very own people. So why would I now want to put myself in league with that God if I know that that God has already rejected that God's original people? Maybe he'll reject me later on as well. Sometimes when I'm teaching undergrads, I explain this as don't date a cheater, right? If you know that a person is a cheater, they cheated on the last person, well, the last thing you want to do is start dating that person. Chances are they'll cheat on you. And so we know that there were Gentiles who were posing this question to Paul. How do we know? Because Paul's final letter that Paul wrote 7 letters that currently appear in the Christian New Testament. And the last of those letters that Paul wrote is the letter to the Romans. And in the letter to the Romans, in chapters 9 through 11, Paul answers directly the question, why should you believe in the God of the Jews if the God of the Jews appears to have sent a Messiah that his own people have rejected? That is the subject of Romans 9 through 11, and that's what I want to talk with you about for the next 20 minutes or so. So in chapters 9 through 11, Paul gives, on the one hand, a terrifying answer to the question, why should you accept the God of Israel if the God of Israel rejected his own people? And he begins by saying, it is not as though the word of God has faltered. In other words, God didn't go back on his promise. Why? Because not all those descended from Israel are really Israel. This is a somewhat scurrilous statement. What he's saying here is, it's not as though God rejected the Jews who have rejected Jesus. The Jews who have rejected Jesus aren't really Jews at all. In other words, people who think they are in the Jewish people, people who think that they are Israel, are not really Israel. Now, Paul was a learned Jew. So as a learned Jew, if he's going to make such an unbelievably scandalous statement, he better darn well defend it in the way that a Jew defends ideas. A Jew defends ideas by giving proof from Scripture. So Paul says, if you've ever wondered how it's possible that certain people who are born as Jews are nonetheless not really Jews, he says all you have to do is go and look at the very first generation of Jews. He says, look, it's not as though all of the seed of Abraham were children of Abraham. For it says in Genesis chapter 21, your seed will be called through Isaac. What's he alluding to here? A story we all know. Abraham had 2 sons, Ishmael and Isaac. And if you are a Jew, the notion is that the covenant with Abraham did not go through Ishmael. That is the Muslim position, of course. The Jewish perspective is, no, the promise went from Abraham to Isaac. In other words, Ishmael was a descendant who was nonetheless not included. And Paul goes on to say, it's not as though that was only true in the first generation. He says, look at the second generation. Rebekah bore 2 children from one father. Rebekah is the wife of Isaac, Abraham's son. Even before they were born, however, or had done any deeds good or bad, she was told the elder will serve the younger. What is he alluding to here? Abraham's son Isaac also had 2 sons, one named Jacob and one named Esau. As Jews, our belief is that the covenant did not go through Esau. It went through Jacob. Why? Because that's what God decreed. But what Paul is saying is that that sets up a paradigm, that even though many people might be descended from Israel or from Abraham, they are nonetheless not reckoned as descendants from that person. And Paul goes on to say that this isn't just the case in the generation of Abraham or in the generation of Isaac or Jacob. It's in every generation. So he quotes Isaiah as having said, though the number of the children of Israel be like the sand of the sea, only a remnant will continue. He quotes Elijah. Remember, Elijah is in the battle with the prophets of Baal, and Elijah says, there's only 7,000 of us left because all of the other Jews have gone astray. So what Paul seems to be suggesting is that in every generation since Abraham himself, there is a constant paring down of Israel, a constant refining of the family of Israel. So to make that graphically more obvious, he says, look, there was once Abraham, and Abraham had two sons, Ishmael and Isaac. Okay. He says, poor Ishmael, he got tossed out of the family tree, and the covenant went to Isaac. Well, Isaac had two kids, Jacob and Esau. But poor Esau, he got kicked out of the family tree. Jacob, of course, had his name changed to Israel. And Israel, Jacob, had many descendants, 12 tribes, who had many more descendants after that. And what happened? According to Paul, in every generation after Jacob, some people were chosen to be a part of the people Israel, and other people were chosen to be rejected from the people Israel. And so Paul believes that that process has continued down to his very own day. And of the Jews who were born in Paul's own day, some have rejected Jesus. Some, like Paul and his buddies, have accepted Jesus. And they are the true representation of Israel in Paul's own day. To reject Jesus is to say, I am no longer a part of the people Israel. But that's only a part of the story. Because Paul says that something else remarkable is happening in his own day, something that has not happened at any other time in Israelite history. And that is that not only is Israel being pared down, well, that's happened in every generation, he would say, but Israel is also being built up by people who were never a part of Israel in the first place. He says, in this hour, in this final hour of history, people who were never Jews in the first place are being brought on board into the family of Israel. He says this in Romans chapter 9 by proclaiming, God has made known the riches of his glory upon the objects of mercy. Who are the objects of God's mercy in Paul's own day? Us, we believers in Jesus, whom he called not only from among Jews, but also from among Gentiles. Now, remember, Paul is a learned Jew. He is making here a scandalous claim that non-Jews have been miraculously turned into Jews. And he has a wonderful prophetic quotation to prove it. The prophet Hosea in chapter 2 says, those who were not my people, I will call my people. Now, for those of you who know Hosea, what is Hosea talking about here? Well, the prophet Hosea is really mad at the Israelites, at the Jewish people. And he says, hey, Jewish people, I'm going to start calling you not my people. But don't worry, because eventually I'll have mercy and I'll start calling you who were not my people, my people. Hosea, I'm not a Christian, so I will say, Hosea was not looking 8 centuries ahead to what was going to happen. But for Paul, a first century Jew, it's not unreasonable for him to have thought, oh, Hosea was talking about my own day. And what Hosea was saying was that a people called not my people, that is to say Gentiles, will be brought into the family tree of Israel. Now, I say family tree very intentionally, because in Romans chapter 11, at the end of this whole discussion, Paul says, look, let me actually talk to you about the family tree of Israel using the metaphor of an olive tree. And he says, look, Israel, God's people Israel, is an olive tree. The roots are the patriarchs. He says that explicitly. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and so on. And he says, Jews who are born on the tree. But in every generation, some Jews are lopped off the tree, either because they follow Baal, or God preordains them for failure like Esau, or in our generation, because they fail to recognize Jesus as Messiah. And he says what's happening remarkably in our own time is that into the family of Israel, the family tree, as though they're getting new parents, Gentiles are being grafted into the tree in place of those Jewish branches that have been lopped off. Now, if Paul had stopped there, it would be quite a difficult message for contemporary Jews to deal with, because what Paul is saying is that, no, there's no problem with the fact that God's people, Israel, have largely rejected his Messiah, because most of what you think are God's people, Israel, are actually not a part of God's people, Israel. They've been lopped off, and they've been replaced by people who are able to see the truth. That's a really tough message. But what blows readers of the New Testament's mind is that in 2 verses after this olive tree metaphor, Paul says something that is totally new and totally different, and it has thrown interpreters of the New Testament for a loop for 2,000 years. Because after Paul has spent 3 chapters explaining how Israel isn't Jews, what Israel is really a collection of Jews who have remained faithful and of Gentiles who have been brought on board, Paul concludes the section with the following claim. I want you to be aware of this mystery, my friends. A hardening has come upon a portion of Israel until the full number of Gentiles enters. And so all Israel will be saved. Now he presents it as a mystery. Mystery in ancient Greek is actually the word mysterion. That's where we get the word mystery. But mystery doesn't mean like we think of mystery today, like some enigmatic thing I can't understand. Mystery means just something that was not understood until the present day, and now I'm explaining it to you. And he says, look, God's plan all along was that some of Israel in this generation would have a hardened heart and not see that Jesus is the Messiah. But that only happened so that Gentiles could come on board, that Gentile branches could come on board. And he says that is the way that all Israel will be saved. Now, the $64,000 question, and I would suggest it's worth much more than just $64,000, is what does Paul mean when he says all Israel will be saved? So what I'm going to do in the last 5 or 10 minutes is tell you the 3 most common explanations for what scholars believe Paul is saying when he says all Israel will be saved. I'm going to present them as the most interfaith friendly, the less interfaith friendly, and the least interfaith friendly. And it goes something like this. The most interfaith friendly way of interpreting what Paul says in Romans 11:26 is that when he says all Israel will be saved, he means all Jews will be saved, and all Jews will be saved as Jews. In other words, what Paul is saying is that this whole thing with Jews not believing in Jesus, it's just a temporary thing that will allow some Gentiles at the end to learn about Jesus, and then God is going to end the world. And when God ends the world, he'll save the Jews who believe in Jesus, he'll save the Gentiles who believe in Jesus, and he'll save all the other Jews just as Jews. There are many scholars who argue for this position, and one of, oh, sorry. I didn't even put it yet. So I'm looking at the wrong thing. I apologize. So all Israel means Jews, and all Jews will be saved as Jews. And as evidence, these scholars would point to something that Paul says a couple lines further on, where he says, the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. Huh. Well, that seems to be different than the claim he was making earlier, where you can get lopped out of the tree. So maybe what Paul is saying is, no, Jews have a permanent call from God. It is irrevocable. And no matter what else happens in the history of the world, Jews are in God's good graces. Some people have argued that Paul says this at the end of Romans 11 because he has a resurgence of Jewish pride. In other words, he's making this point, which he has to make intellectually, that Jews who do not accept Jesus really aren't Jews. But at the end, he says, no, that can't be the case. There must be a reason for this rejection. And in the end, all Jews will be fine. Well, obviously, I think that's interfaith friendly because it would have Paul saying, yes, Jews are accepted as Jews. Lovely. A less interfaith friendly reading, and I think the most popular reading among New Testament scholars today, would be to say that Paul does mean that all Israel is Jews. But what he's saying is that the end of the process is that all Jews will be saved, not because they're Jews, but because all Jews will become Christians. So usually the argument here is that what Paul is saying in Romans 9 through 11 is that many Jews have rejected Jesus. Why? In order to make room in the family tree for Gentiles. Yay! And then once all of the Gentiles are on board, Jews will see that Gentiles have been included in God's family, and they will become jealous, and that jealousy will move them to accept Jesus, and they will be brought back into the family. And there's good reason for arguing this, because Paul says earlier in Romans 11, the whole reason I am going out to Gentiles, I glorify my ministry to Gentiles in order to make my own people jealous. In other words, I'm going to them and saying, all right, Gentiles, you join the family of Israel. And then my Jewish friends who don't know the truth, they'll realize how wrong they are and they'll all get on board. So in this less interfaith friendly reading, what Paul is saying is that, yes, eventually all Jews will be saved because they'll realize the truth and they'll become Christians. Now, this is less interfaith friendly, I suppose, but honestly, I don't think it's that objectionable a view at all. As a Jew, at the end of every prayer service, I sing Aleinu L'Shabeach, which includes a prayer to God that one day all tongues will swear loyalty to my God and all knees will bow before my God. There is also a strain in Judaism that says, in the end, everyone will realize that we're right. There really is only one God, and that's the only God to worship. So I don't think it's outrageous for a religious tradition to say, yeah, we think we're right, and we think one day everybody will see that we're right. And in this second option, I think that's what Paul is saying. Now, the third option is the most pernicious, and it's the option that was followed by Augustine, and eventually by Calvin and many others. And this argument would be that when Paul says all Israel will be saved, what he means is all Israel, the Gentiles who believe in Jesus and the Jews who believe in Jesus, the true Israel, the real Israel, that all Israel will be saved. And if you don't accept Jesus of Nazareth as your Savior, as your Messiah, then you're simply not in Israel any longer. This is what we might call true, authentic supersessionism, that the people of Israel is no longer the Jewish people, but the people of Israel is the people who believe in Christ. Now, that in the mouth of Augustine or in the mouth of Calvin can become very problematic because it denies the very identity of the Jewish people who claim that they are Israel. Which is why I suggest that this is the least interfaith-friendly way of reading Romans 11:26. In the last couple of minutes before I take questions, I want to leave you with a problem. I've read Romans 9 through 11 1,000 times. I've written articles on it and a book on it. And I'm convinced that this is right. Not that it's right and that I believe it, but I'm convinced that grammatically, this is what Paul is actually saying. That Paul does not believe that Jews who have not accepted Jesus will be saved in the end. And he is arguing that the real identity of Israel are those people, Jew or Gentile, who have accepted the resurrection of Christ. Now, it seems odd that if I genuinely believe that, I also consider to be Paul my chum. I have a Paul action figure. I write books on Paul. I'm obsessed with Paul. Why would that be the case? Well, let me give you a couple of reasons why I think it's okay that Paul said this. One, I don't have this on a screen, so you just have to watch my face. I realize it's getting dark here in Los Angeles and the background's getting darker and my face is getting brighter. Plus, when I talk about Paul, I beam. So, why do I not have a problem with this? One, first, let's keep in mind, Paul thought the end of the world was coming any day now. He didn't think that he was dispossessing the Jewish people. He didn't think that, oh, there's going to be centuries down the line where Christians are going to inherit the Roman Empire and make life miserable for Jews because they see themselves as a superseding people. Paul didn't know any of that. Paul thought Jesus of Nazareth was coming tomorrow or next week or the next year. And he thought that it was critical that everybody recognize the need to be baptized into the death and resurrection of Jesus in order to stand justified before God at the final judgment. He was just an apocalyptic Jew, an end of times Jew who believed that something dramatic and radical about the nature of the Jewish people was happening. I suspect, and I realize this is sacrilegious, if Paul had lived 50 years longer, 100 years longer, if Paul got in a DeLorean that could travel through time and it showed up in the year 450 around the time of Augustine, a little later, and said, wait a minute, you mean Jesus hasn't come back yet? My guess is he would reconfigure everything he said. So when we keep Paul in his own context as an apocalyptic Jew who thought the end of the world was nigh, I don't think we have to judge him so harshly for sort of dispossessing the Jewish people from their claim to the title of Israel. But now I want to say one more thing and then I'll finish. And this is a little more personal. One of the reasons I love Paul, even though he's quite a radical who would look to, I guess, dispossess me from my inheritance in Israel, is that I see a tremendous amount of myself in Paul. What do I mean by that? I'm a Reformed Jew. I'm a pretty damn proud Reformed Jew. And what does Reformed Jew mean to me? It means that something dramatic happened to the Jewish people in the 19th century. There was medieval Judaism. After Moses Mendelson, the 19th century came about. Jews were emancipated and joined the peoples of Europe. More importantly, Jews experienced enlightenment. They understood over time that women should have equal rights. They understood over time that distinctions between priests and non-priests are no longer relevant. They understood over time that the Torah should be read as a historical document and subjected to the analysis of empirical historians. In other words, Jews became enlightened in the 19th century. And I would argue that the experience of Jews in the 19th century, having been emancipated and enlightened, was something that they couldn't unknow. I can't unknow that dramatic experience, but all that I can do and all that Reformed Jews did in the 19th century was say, how can we reorient and re-understand Judaism in light of emancipation and enlightenment? And what they created was Reformed Judaism. And Reform Judaism, if you think about it, is really darn radical when you compare it to all the Judaism that preceded it over 20 centuries. Now, why is that similar to Paul? I think Paul was a very loyal, pious Jew, and he genuinely believed that Jesus had risen from the dead. I don't believe Jesus had risen from the dead. I don't believe that. But Paul did. And he couldn't unknow that. He couldn't deny it in the same way that I can't deny my experience of enlightenment. And so, as a first century Jew, Paul had to say, how do I make sense of this? What does this mean for Judaism in the first century? Well, it must mean that this is the end. And in the end, Gentiles come on board. And in the end, everyone is judged. And in the end, the backwardness of some Jews is going to, see the light of day. And all of this is going to happen. And he tried to reconfigure a Judaism that made sense to him, that was admittedly radical, but that was based on a real personal experience that he couldn't unknow or deny. And so in that way, I kind of admire Paul for saying, this is what I experienced, this is what I believe, and therefore this is what Judaism has to become. Now, what he saw Judaism becoming historically became Christianity. He didn't see that coming. And I see a lot of that in the way I experience Reform Judaism today. That's why I love my buddy Paul, who I'll put on the final slide. Thank you.
Well, that was on my mind. First of all, I'm back in rabbinical school, which is always a wonderful place to be. And I'm thinking of the conversations that we had in some of the classrooms in the areas around the college in LA. So first of all, thank you so much, Rabbi Garroway, for spending your time with us this evening and putting off your dinner, which I'm sure will be coming not too far from now. I hope you can make it back to the house safely from the darkness that you have. We've been sitting in for many hours here. So for everybody who is watching, either if you're watching on Zoom or you're watching on Facebook, if you have questions you want to raise to Rabbi Garroway, you can put them in the Q&A in the Zoom or the chats. There's been a little bit of a feed going on in Facebook, and I got to give credit to Susan Goldstein for raising a question that we're not going to be able to answer, but I want to share with the group is, why weren't we taught this in Sunday school? Which I think is the question that most people think about when we have these conversations around the origins of Judaism and Christianity. But I want to start with a question because it's something that has always bugged me, and I've learned this from you before and thought about it, which is, what was motivating Paul to bring people along with him? Right? He spends a lot of time trying to describe who are the people who get to go where he's going. Why did he care about anybody but himself? If he knew the way to get to wherever he wanted to go, why was he so interested in making that open to at least the right group of people to come along with him?
That's interesting. And I'll say something that might not be well received, but let's see how it goes. Why do people go on Facebook and they look for a comment from someone who says, Donald Trump is great, and then spend an hour in comments trying to convince that person that in fact Donald Trump is not great? You can switch the names. That Obama is great, and then maybe they go on trying to explain that Obama isn't great. Why are people all over Twitter and Facebook constantly trying to get people to see what they see? Now, one could make maybe a theological or a religious argument that when you believe that something is true and that God is, that the fate of your fellow's hands will potentially depends on you sharing the truth with them. Well, maybe it's actually an act of love, an act of ethical love to share with them the truth. I think that's what many Christians would say. But another argument might be a psychological argument. Why is it that people go on Facebook and Twitter and constantly argue with people they're never going to convince? Well, I would suggest that psychologically, it's because of a deep-seated insecurity. I'm not sure that I'm right. And so if I keep fighting with people, then maybe I'll figure out that I actually am right. Now, was Paul a deeply insecure psychological person? Was he a person motivated by ethical love? I don't know. But I don't think it's that unusual that a person who firmly believes in a truth feels compelled to share that and convince other people. Sorry, I'm going to stop sharing. I think that's happening.
I just turned it off so we
Okay,
can
good.
see your countenance so well. Another question that is, I think, related, and this question comes from Nancy Eisenberg, which is, in the time of Paul, why not become a Jew? And I'm going to add to that, if you could spend a moment maybe clarifying or reiterating, like, what was the reason, what was the presumption that God had rejected God's own people, Israel, in the generation of Paul? What was the basis for that presumption?
Okay, well, those are two different questions, but I think I can deal with both of them. I'm actually going to move. I wonder if I can. No, I can't do that. Sometimes I like to move my head so it's near the camera because I'm very vain and I can't stop looking at myself, but I have to look at the green light. Okay. The answer to the question, why would a person not want to become a Jew? Well, there are simple, funny answers and more complicated answers. The simple, funny answer is, and Rabbi Dan or Rabbi Greg, I don't know if you're Rabbi Greg or Weissman, but I've heard Rabbi Dan. You've had middle-aged male converts. That's still an issue. And it was an issue then, not only because of the pain and discomfort of circumcision, but also because a circumcised penis was seen as grotesque in the ancient world. In America today, it's pretty normal, but in the ancient world, it was seen as a disfigurement. But that's only a part of it, and that only applies to half of the potential Christians because that wasn't obviously an issue for women. But maybe I'll put this in a controversial way. In contemporary discussions on race, I've heard people ask in order to prove a point, well, who would want to become a Black female? Now, I'm not sure that's the case, and I'm not sure the Black females would agree, but I've heard that point made, meaning, why would you want to join a people that struggles mightily, that is often looked down on by society, and so on and so forth? And there were all kinds of stereotypes and hatreds of Jews in the ancient Greco-Roman world. Now, it wasn't as though everybody hated Jews, because I've already talked about the presence of God-fearers in synagogues. People who said, no, I like that group. But Jews were nonetheless a people that had a lot of slurs spoken about them. They were seen as an unloyal people. They didn't worship the city's gods. You couldn't necessarily trust them because they wouldn't swear by the gods of the city, this kind of thing. And so to decide to join the Jewish people in the first century was social suicide in the eyes of a lot of people. The second question was about...
It was, what was the basis in the first century for the presumption that God had rejected God's own people?
Oh, well, because the overwhelming majority of Jews, didn't buy the message. So the situation I was describing before is Paul is writing a letter to Rome because he's about to go to Rome and try to convince people. And he's heard that one of the things he's going to have to deal with when he gets there is that Gentiles who are thinking about joining him, they say, well, wait a minute. I know 10 Jews down the road in the Suburra in Rome, and they all tell me I'm nuts. They all say this Jesus thing is crazy. Well, if they're the people of the God of Israel and they're saying it's crazy, are you telling me that the God of Israel is just rejecting them? Well, if the God of Israel is rejecting them, why would I want to join the God of Israel? Maybe next year he'll reject me. So the whole problem of, one could argue, and I have, that Jewish unbelief was one of the first problems the Christian community ever had to deal with. And to some extent, they're dealing with it until the present day. And sometimes, in many cases, it's honestly an innocent curiosity. And I'm sure in interfaith relations, you've had this question all the time where Christians will say, I just don't get how Jews don't believe. It's your scriptures. It's your God. How do you not get it? And what I'm suggesting is that that was an issue in the very first years of Christianity and continues to this day.
So David has raised two questions that are independent. One, I think, is maybe easier, which is the people that we're talking about, the Gentiles. He asks, what percentage of them were religious versus pagan Gentile? Like, what was the religiosity of the market share, so to speak, for Paul at the time?
They were all what I would call urban pagans, meaning they worshipped the gods of their city and the gods of their realm. And they believed that there were many gods. I mean, if it's a Roman environment, the Roman gods. If it's a Greek environment, the Greek gods. If it's a Phrygian environment in Turkey, then the Phrygian gods. And their belief was that the God of Israel was one of those gods. Of course, what Paul was asking them to believe, and what Jews would have asked them to believe, is that no. In fact, the God of Israel is one of those gods, but the God of Israel is actually the only one of those gods. And the only people in the first century, other than Jews, who would have made that argument were actually philosophers. Philosophers often made the case in the first century, yeah, all that God stuff is nonsense. There's kind of one force behind it all. But that was always expressed philosophically and not as part of a religious community. Your average person in Rome or Corinth or Ephesus or Alexandria, they were just standard urban Roman pagans.
Another question. This comes from Bob, which and he's read, by the way. I should warn you. He's read Zealot by Reza Aslan, and his
Sure.
question comes based on. I'm sure you've looked at it well. So his question was, considering all of the disciples and all of the people who come out of the world thinking about Jesus as a potential Messiah, what was it about Paul that made him so persuasive and effective? And Bob's question presumes the most persuasive and effective, but maybe could you speak to, was Paul the greatest of the apostles or most effective, and why was that?
Okay. There's a way I like to answer that. It's sort of generic, but I think it's correct. And I don't know if you're familiar with, I'm drawing a brief blank here. The Protestant work ethic and the spirit of capitalism, Max Weber, sociologist Max Weber. I once read in something that he wrote a point that blew my mind. And he argued that the success of a new movement, a new political movement, a new religious movement, it thrives to the extent that it is able to capitalize on the benefits of its predecessor and negate the shortcomings of its predecessor. A similar example to this, maybe that's a little less highfalutin, is the college basketball coach, Mike Krzyzewski, incredibly successful college basketball coach at Duke. His teacher was Bobby Knight, the very controversial basketball coach at Army and at Indiana. And apparently, Bobby Knight's letter of recommendation to Duke when they were thinking about hiring Krzyzewski, the recommendation was, hire this man. He has all of my good qualities and none of my bad. So I think Weber would argue that what Paul was able to do so beautifully was capitalize on all of the things that first century Judaism did well and were considered desirable, like one God and ethics and community loyalty and integrity and so on and so forth. But he got rid of and an old law book, but he got rid of all the things that people thought were kind of yucky and gross about Jews. They circumcise their penises. They don't eat pork. All of those things that made Jews look weird and ethnic and barbarian, he got rid of those, all of the bad things, but kept all of the good things. And I think Weber would argue that's what made it so appealing. It was, at least in first century sociological terms, a better Judaism. I don't believe that, but I think that's one of the reasons why it's a cleaned up Judaism for the world.
So it was a question that came in the chat about the relationship between some of the ideas of Paul and Kabbalistic theory. The notion, and I want to get the question right, that if you believe and you practice in a certain way, that sort of that everyone will be made Israel. I think it's a play on that word Hosea. So is there any connection that you can think of, or what a relationship between some of the thinking of the Kabbalists and the thinking of Paul?
I'm not sure there's that much of a connection, because what to me marks off Kabbalism is so remarkably unique, at least in the history of Jewish ideas, is the idea of a multifaceted and dynamic God. That's what makes Kabbalah Kabbalah. It's the complete opposite of, say, the philosophical God that is just the single point that, the Kabbalistic God is 10 parts that are constantly in motion and constantly doing different things and so on and so forth. And I don't think Paul would have thought anything like that. However, and if I'm ever in the Boca Raton area, my grandparents used to live at Palmer. They're no longer with us. But if I were to go and visit them, 20 years ago, I could come by and teach you about something called Gnosticism, which was a slightly later Christian development in the late 1st and 2nd centuries, a form of Christianity, Manichaean, I see down here in the chat. I can't quite read it because I took my glasses off. But Manichaean Christianity was very much similar to medieval Kabbalah. Indeed, when if I teach ancient Christianity and Gnosticism in rabbinical school, I always bring in medieval Jewish Kabbalah. And if I bring in medieval Jewish Kabbalah, I always bring in Gnosticism, because they are so similar in their notion of a multifaceted, dynamic Godhead.
Okay. So this is going to be the final question that we're going to answer. However, Rabbi Garroway has shared with us that we can share his email address with the other questioners, and if you have follow-up questions, we can make sure that you can be in touch with him, and you can write him an epistle, and he will write one back on email. So the question had to do with when you described the wondering about how Paul would have responded to a couple of centuries later and seeing that there was not a second coming of Jesus. How do we then explain the later Roman emperors? And I'm thinking in particular of Constantine, who in that exact time period, if anything, went even further into it and brought the whole Roman Empire into Christianity. So how do you explain, how would you explain that piece of it, having said what you said about what you think Paul would have thought?
Sure. So one of the key principles that one is taught when one studies ancient Christianity is a formative principle known as the delay of the parousia. So parousia is a fancy Greek word that refers to the return of Jesus from heaven. So it's actually a pretty cool Greek word. It refers to, I think, I was going to say we don't do this anymore, but kind of President Trump kind of did. In the old days, when a king would like tour through his realm and stop by in each city, and the parousia was something like the appearance of the ruler as he approached the city and the retinue was there. That refers to the parousia. And so the parousia would be when Jesus returns, in Paul's mind, imminently, and the world is judged and the consummation of the world that was always expected is brought about. And so already in the mid to late 1st century, you start to see Christian thinkers start to deal with the problem. Well, wait a minute. We thought this was like a 5-year thing, but now we're into a 50-year thing. And so we need to start, for example, setting up a leadership structure. We need episcopoi, bishops, and we need presbyteroi, priests, and we need to start having rules about what you can do. And by the time you get into the 2nd century, Christianity, as it emerges, starts downplaying that apocalyptic role. It's always there, but Christianity, as it emerges in the 2nd and 3rd and 4th centuries, starts to no longer see itself as something that is a very brief temporary phenomenon, but rather something that is there for the long haul. I'll just make one more point. I mentioned that Paul is responsible for 7 letters in the New Testament. I hope there are some Catholic listeners who are saying, that's not true. There's 13 or 14 letters of Paul in the New Testament. Well, that's the Catholic confessional position, but the historical position is that only 7 of those 13 are actual letters of Paul. Why am I mentioning that? Because there are 2 letters to by Paul in the New Testament to the city of Thessaloniki. And in the first, which I think is genuine to Paul, Paul's talking about how Jesus is about to come back. And he's like, yeah, because the people in Thessaloniki are freaking out because their dads and grandpas have died. And they're like, well, that stinks, because now when Jesus comes back, nothing's going to happen. They're going to lose out. And Paul says, no, don't worry, because they're going to rise from their graves first and meet Jesus in the heavens. It's in some ways the origin of the modern notion of rapture. One of the reasons why many people don't think that the second epistle to the Thessalonians in the New Testament is genuinely from Paul is because it seems to have an awareness that, Jesus isn't coming back as fast as we thought he was. It's going to be delayed. We need to settle in. And a number of scholars have said, not only is that an indication that you have a non-Pauline author, it's an indication that already in the late, the end of Paul's career or the decade after, Christians were starting to cope with the fact that the end was not going to come as soon as they thought that it was.
So we really want to thank you, Dr. Garroway, for a really fascinating presentation and for exposing this really unbelievable, it's so intricate way of understanding Paul and the way in which Judaism and Christianity sort of tango with each other at the beginning of the Common Era. It was really fascinating. And I have all kinds of questions I'm going to put in the chat for you also. But we are blessed because we have the opportunity to learn a couple more times with Dr. Garroway over the course of this weekend. So tomorrow night, 7:30, as part of Temple Bethel's services, you can watch just like you are here on Zoom or on Temple Bethel's live stream. Go to www.tbeboca.org and you can find the link for the live stream for tomorrow night's service, where Dr. Garroway will be speaking about what we as Jews have to learn from Catholicism. And then at the 12:15 Mass at St. Joan of Arc Catholic Church on Sunday, Dr. Garroway will also be presenting the flip side of that. What do Catholics have to learn from us as Jews? On behalf of Monsignor Michael McGraw, my partner and friend and the leader of St. Joan of Arc Catholic Church, we really hope that you will continue to join us for our Interfaith programming this weekend. You can watch on Facebook Live, either on St. Joan of Arc Catholic Church's page or on Temple Bethel's page on Friday night, or you can join us also through our YouTube stream as well. So information is all found at the Temple's website, and we wish you all a good night. We look forward to spending Shabbat and the Sabbath with you. Shabbat Shalom, and thanks again, Dr. Garroway.
Thank you.